Hello, everyone. We are doing our ethnic studies YouTube series again. And today I am interviewing Dr. Caronan, so she can introduce herself a little bit.
Hi, everyone. I am, I usually go by Professor Caronan. I do have a PhD, but I prefer professor rather than doctor. My name is Faye Caronan. I'm the current chair of the Ethnic Studies Department. I was just recently announced as the Chancellor's Faculty Fellow for the year on matters of diversity, equity, and inclusion. I teach a lot of things, but I'm the one who teaches the Asian American Studies courses on campus. I've been here since 2009, so it hasn't felt that long, but it's been a long while now. Let's see, other things about me. I like to bike commute. I bike commute to campus when we're actually going to campus. And I have 3 kids.
Awesome. Thank you for introducing yourself. So the first question we have for you today is, why and how did you get into ethnic studies?
So the way I got into ethnic studies, I want to say that part of it was, my own interest, and I didn't quite know what I was looking for yet. So when I was in high school, my older sister was in college, and I guess she must have been taking an Asian studies course or an Asian history course or something, because she came home with books that had the histories of Southeast Asia, and I began to read through them. And for me, there was it told the history of these countries before, from my perspective, before the point of migration for people like me and other Asian Americans. I grew up in Southern California around a lot of other Asian Americans. And so for me, finding that book was kind of like learning about the histories of all these different Asian groups before migrating to the United States, because I felt like I knew what that story was. Parents came over, worked really hard, et cetera, et cetera. And so I was curious about, that history already when I went to college, and I was talking through my interests with my faculty advisor. And he actually said, you should take an Asian American Studies course. And that was the first time I heard about Asian American Studies. And so I took his advice, I took the course. And it was at that point that I realized that when I was reading those Asian history books, or the Southeast Asian history books, what I was really looking for was Asian American history, because that Asian American course, gave me some background to that history in Asia, but also to the kind of historical forces that led different Asian groups to migrate here. And, not just the push factors, but the pull factors as well. And not just, the United States is this place of great opportunity. There is opportunity here, but also, because the Immigration Act changed. And why did that change? Why was there this lull in immigration prior to that? So it gave me that sense of trying to figure out where I belonged, that I had already been investigating, but I didn't, someone needed to point me in the right direction. And from there, I took Asian American Studies courses, the Asian American Studies Resource Center at my undergraduate, at Cornell University, was right next to the Latino Studies Resource Center. And so there's just this one day, it was really serendipitous. I was reading, and it was probably an article on US imperialism in the Philippines and how that relates to Filipino Americans. And there just happened to be this group of Puerto Rican students in the Latino Studies Resource Center, and they were talking about US imperialism in Puerto Rico. And I was reading this book and I went, wait a minute, you're talking about the same things that I'm reading in this book. But because we have these racial constructions that often, lead us to think about ethnic groups in separate ways, I thought it was powerful to say, oh, I was making these, these connections across racial racial categories. And it was at that point that I thought, okay, I'm not only taking Asian American studies. I took I took a course in, the program there was Africana studies, because it was diasporic African American studies. So I took courses in Africana studies. I took courses in Latino studies. I just took all of these different courses because I thought I'm going to understand how all of these are interrelated. And that was what kind of set me on my research path and my path towards getting a PhD in ethnic studies.
Awesome, thank you. So for our second question, is there anything in ethnic studies that has changed from the time that you were a student to now?
Yes. So I think I want to say that a lot of things that I track might be more specific to Asian American studies, because that's kind of my that's the conference I go to every year. I know one thing in ethnic studies in general is kind of this turn towards the transnational, because ethnic studies used to be very US centric. Ethnic studies scholars were studying the experiences of groups in the United States. And that often is still the case, but there's this look towards trying to understand the processes of power transnationally or globally. So, indigenous studies today looks at the impact of settler colonialism, not just in the United States, but, across the world, right? So that's one example of that transnational turn. There's also, within the field of Asian American studies, interrogating how, the kind of junctures of Asian studies and Asian American studies, where do they meet? How could they inform each other? How can they disrupt each other? How can they critique each other? So I think that has been one major turn. And then specifically in Asian American studies, there's been this of kind of burgeoning of looking at refugees and being, critical refugee studies, and, really being cognizant of the differences between the immigrant experience versus the refugee experience, being critical of how refugees have been historically represented and what that means. So those are, some of the broad ways the field has advanced as a student.
For our next question, why do you believe ethnic studies is important, and how do we benefit from ethnic studies?
I believe ethnic studies is important because it really, what it asks us to do is to interrogate the workings of power. I began by talking about my story and how I began to understand my place in the United States, how my family came to be here. And that at once is a very personal story, but it's also a story of historical power. It's a story of US imperialism in the Philippines. There are specific reasons why we are in the places that we are. And when you take away those, when you don't learn those stories, we're left with narratives like the immigrant narrative of success that hide the workings of power. If I only had the story of immigrant success, I would not know about how the US occupied the Philippines from 1898 to, the 1940s. And so I really think that ethnic studies is critical to understanding power. I mean, specifically racial power and in this country, but also since the US is a global power, to understanding how that works out across the globe as well. And so within that, when you look at it that way, it becomes important for ethnic studies in, I would say, every profession, because you can look into, if you're in the health field, you could look into racial disparities in healthcare. You can look into racial disparities in Hollywood. You can look into racial and ethnic disparities in education. And all of those questions lead to the goal of how then do we equitably treat, educate, represent uh, diverse populations in our country and even around the globe. So it leads to these questions of social justice and how can we, try to make the world a better, more equitable place for other people. And that, it begins with interrogating our structures of power and then figuring out how are we going to change those.
Um, what are some projects you are working on right now?
So research-wise, what I've been working on for a while now is looking at the U.S. territories. So my first book, I looked at Puerto Rico and the Philippines, or I was looking at U.S. Puerto Ricans and Filipino American culture in order to understand U.S. empire better. I made the argument that if you look at U.S. Puerto Rican and Filipino American culture, you get this critique of how the U.S. implemented colonial power in Puerto Rico and the Philippines. And together gives you this more comprehensive understanding of U.S. power as opposed to looking at them separately. So right now, I've been thinking about territorial citizens because, often in our civil rights discourse, we talk about citizenship and equal rights for all citizens. And it seems, citizenship is somehow thought of as this, once you get it, then you can strive towards equal rights. But I don't think that's quite the case. And we can, we know that because of all these racial disparities, but I'm trying to point to it in the way that you have these US citizens, like say in Puerto Rico, they're US citizens, but they absolutely do not have the same rights as citizens in the 50 states. So just to interrogate, what we think of the citizenship, and also to point out that, first of all, people don't often think about the United States beyond the 50 states. And so to think about these territories, which are majority people of color, and how they are not equal to, the US states, and, why that is, to think about why that is. And yeah, so that's broadly what I've been working on. There are different, more specific categories within that, but that's the main question I've been thinking through.
How have you contributed to the department, to ethnic studies, and to the community?
So for the department, I've been the chair now since 2017, I think. And in that time, I've done a few things. There's the Latinx certificate that will be coming out next fall. I'm working on an ethnic studies graduate certificate. And then beyond that, I've been looking at how to, I've cross-listed a few courses, trying to figure out how to work with other departments in order to advocate for ethnic studies. Yeah, but I will say that even in my time as chair, I will say that Soteria has done the bulk of the work. She has, if you see the changes that have occurred when I was chair in terms of our social media presence, in terms of how we try to connect to students. That has all been so Terry, although I've tried to steer the department in that way. She's been the person who has executed that strategy. Okay, so your question was the department. Was there something else before the community, or?
Just ethnic studies in general.
Oh, okay. So you said the department, and then I will say that in terms of the wider community, I'm involved with some API groups outside of the university. I'm a board member at the Denver Language School. So most of my community work still revolves around education and ethnic studies, and basically thinking about putting theory into practice. How do we actually do this work in the communities?
What is one change within the community or society that you hope to see in your lifetime?
I think, I think it's that, ethnic studies is absolutely vital at the college level, but I believe that ethnic studies, or at least the, experiences, the histories of, different racial and ethnic groups should actually be incorporated much earlier. So in K through 12, because for me, it seems, the way that I came to it was the way many of my students and my other peers came to ethnic studies, or that they didn't learn their own histories until they got into a college classroom. And so I think that if ethnic studies curriculum started much earlier, and students of color could see themselves and how they fit into society and into US history much earlier, that they would do that, their performance in school would be, they would perform better at the K through 12 level, and that it would set them up for, for success. It would also, having that curriculum in the K through 12 would also mean that those teachers would understand the students that they are teaching, because they'd be teaching that to the students. So I think that it will go a long way in, helping some of the problems that we students of color face in K through 12 and in getting into college.
Do you think that that's achievable? I know that California has been on the way to doing that, to getting it into high schools, and they just have ethnic studies as a requirement in colleges now. Do you think that that's achievable for Colorado?
For Colorado, I think that it can be. I know that recently there was some legislation that had passed about, it wasn't as concrete as the ethnic studies requirement in the K through 12. I think it may have been a recommendation to teach the histories of different groups, but there was, at least the last time I looked at that piece of legislation, it wasn't clear if, to me at least, if there was follow-up, if there was an oversight committee to make sure that that would actually be instituted and practiced across the state, or if it was just a recommendation. So I think that there is some movement in that direction. I think that perhaps if we thought smaller, maybe just within the Denver public schools, that that we might be able to see, that might be doable sooner rather than later. But then again, I think a lot depends on students and parents actually wanting it, and so advocating to have that curriculum in the schools. And then given the current political climate in general, I think that, that's just a hindrance. So in the, hopefully in the short term. But again, I don't know. It just depends on, things have to change in the right ways, and you have to have not just ethnic studies educators, but a lot of people calling for that to be put into place. I mean, that's how it's been done in California. That you've had a lot of people organizing to get the CSU requirement, the ethnic studies requirement at the Cal States that had recently been signed by the governor, and then to get the K through 12 requirement as far as it has gone there.
Last question that I have for you is, what advice would you give to major and minor students about like career choices that they have after they complete their degree? What are some options that they have, or what, some advice that you would give them?
I think ethnic studies ethnic studies majors and minors have a lot of options after graduation. Often people will think about the liberal arts and they'll think, what do I do with this? But you learn a lot of skills when you have an ethnic studies education. Like you'll be able to leverage the fact that you will be able, you're culturally competent. So if you are interested in being an educator, that's going to be a plus. If you want to be an educator in diverse communities, if you are wanting to be in the health field, you'll be able to say, as a practitioner, that you'll be understanding of the needs of different cultural groups, and that you'll be sensitive to how to deliver messages to different diverse groups. We have graduates who are in the field of journalism. We have had graduates who have gone on to get or pursue their PhDs. It's just, there's a wide range of what can be done with an ethnic studies major or minor. It can be applied in in communicating with diverse audiences. If you wanted to go into media relations, there's just a lot. I think it's just a matter, but I would tell majors and minors is that whatever career goal you have, that if you come in to see the ethnic studies faculty, they'll be able to look over. I mean, people will say to go to the career center, and that is right. They will give you good advice. But if you want to know exactly how to leverage your ethnic studies major or minor, it might also help to ask one of your ethnic studies professors to see if you are highlighting the skills that you learned in ethnic studies, on your resume and your cover letter.
Thank you. Is there any other advice or anything else that you want to say to students before we end?
Yeah, I don't think so.
Okay. Thank you for interviewing with us today.
No problem.